Good afternoon, everyone. Erich Prince here, Merion West. Today I'm joined by Dr. Clay Routledge, who is the Vice President of Research and Director of the Human Flourishing Lab at the Archbridge Institute and the co-editor of Perfectus magazine. He formerly was a professor at North Dakota State University, and Clay and I had a great time when he joined me when I had my show on Call-In about a year or so ago. So I think this is a little bit of a follow-up conversation, and we'll sort of build on some of the themes there. And there's so many places to start, but why don't we start, Clay, with your Wall Street Journal op-ed that was just out in the past several days. And I read it and I thought it was very interesting. And for those who haven't seen it yet, maybe you can summarize what you were talking about in that article.
Yeah, of course. So basically, the thrust of the article is that many of us are aware of the growing mental health problems happening in America, particularly among young adults, but also among other groups as well. The rise in loneliness, anxiety, depression, and related psychological issues like pessimism, hopelessness. And it's important for us to be aware of that because if you have a problem and you want to solve it, you kind of need to know about it first. So that's good. I think there's general consensus about the importance of awareness. But it also creates this potential challenge, and that's what I really got into in this piece, which is the more we focus on a problem, the more we become aware of it. It's good on from the perspective of reducing stigma, for instance, or getting more people to want to solve this problem, but it also has the risk of fixating our attention on it and really increasing our tendency to start to define ourselves as mentally unwell as a society. And that's got some negative consequences. Like the more a person ruminates on something, the more they kind of turn inward and start to think about the ways that they're unhappy or lonely or distressed, the more likely they are to start to think of themselves as that type of person, which makes them more likely to become that type of person, what's sometimes referred to as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Mm-hmm. And so what I was trying to do with that piece is say, as much as it's important to raise mental health awareness so we can, address very real concerns, it's also important to think about how we talk about it. And the current approach, particularly online and in social media spaces, is a very self-indulgent approach. I think it's like I need to focus on my mental health. I need to worry about myself and to prioritize my feelings and my thoughts, and people need to recognize that. But that actually doesn't do a lot to help people feel better. Well, it turns out some of the things that are the most effective at making people less distressed and more likely to flourish are actually going out in the world and doing things, making friends, contributing to society, physical fitness, spending time in nature, experiences involving awe, all the things that involve thrusting yourself into the world, throwing yourself out there, and living a full life. And that's, honestly antagonistic to sitting around and ruminating about your own mental health. So that was the idea. Like we need to address mental health, but we need a new approach, and one that focuses more on action, more on outward oriented activity, more on thinking about others, and engaging in the world.
So I'm not sure if you saw this, Clay, but not terribly long ago, Matt Lewis, who was and is a columnist at the Daily Beast, had a conversation with George Will. And it started out by talking about sort of men wearing blue jeans. And I basically prefer the world where men didn't wear blue jeans. And Matt Lewis said something to the effect of, but that was the time of men who were kind of bottling everything up and everything like that and stiff upper lip. And George Will has, in my view, this sort of unbelievable response that I have never forgotten, where he says, basically, society runs on suppressing things. Our entire civilization runs on basically taking certain negative thoughts or negative emotions that we have and keeping them closer to the vest and in check and sort of getting on with things. Do you think that's an idea that's related in any way to some of the things you're talking about in your article?
I mean, yes, so I guess I'd be more hesitant to use the word suppress, because at least from a, more like psychological
That's
tradition,
why I
like,
asked you, because I think that's kind of where the debate is. Because I think a lot
yeah,
of psychologists, and again, my degree is not in psychology, but
yeah,
interested in the field. Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death was a book that
hmm
influenced me very early on in sort of my own thinking about issues. So I'm interested in psychology, and I know that among people who that's sort of their bailiwick, a lot of the commentaries about how we shouldn't necessarily suppress things. And I think that was why the George Will answer was so unexpected or jarring or interesting to the people who saw it, or at least to me.
yeah, yeah. And in fairness, I haven't seen that, but where I think there might be some overlap is, what I'm arguing is, if you actually are out, if you're like actually doing things, productive things with your life, you won't need to suppress, because you will be channeling that energy into something that actually pushes you forward. So when I think of suppression, I don't necessarily think of someone being active. Someone like doing something constructive. I think of them just bottling, like trying to like really hold something in. And what I'm saying is, it's normal to feel anxious and to feel distressed. And there obviously are some people that are really immobilized by that and really suffer from severe psychopathology. And that's kind of a separate issue, like people who have real deep problems. But for most people, you can kind of regulate that yourself. And again, I think that's where there might be some overlap, like self-regulation, regulating your own emotions, is something most people are capable of doing, and it doesn't require like bottling it up. But likewise, it also doesn't require like you constantly expressing it and thinking about it and sharing it with everyone. So I do think there's some common ground there that I would share with George Will, that there's something about not fixating too much on your own problems and really dwelling on them, but instead like doing something. And when I say do something, I mean, I don't just mean like go out and build, like build a barn or something like that. Like, parenting, having hobbies, going to work, volunteering in your community, engaging in, some kind of artistic expression. I mean, things that really take your creative energy, um, and channel it into some kind of content creation or some type of work or product or service, is a good way to focus your attention away from yourself and towards improving the world. And it turns out when people are doing that, and when they're going out and they're engaging with the world, for one, you're just less likely you're not going to be ruminating on your own problems because you're distracted, right? You're
Is it
doing
true
other
what they
things.
sometimes say, that a person can only think about one thing at once?
Yeah, yeah.
In a way, if you're anxious about something and then you're able to think or do something else, sort of almost by definition, you're not thinking about whatever you're anxious about.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think part of the problem in our modern society, and to be clear, I'm a big advocate for technological advancements. I mean, you and I are able to have this conversation many miles apart, and thanks to technology. And I appreciate that. Like, I'm able to work remotely. There's just so many ways in which modern computer technology has dramatically improved our lives. But it's also, perhaps created, or at least amplified, some vulnerabilities. And I think one of the challenges is it does increase the likelihood that people will be more passively doing, they'll be at home in front of screens, where sure, you can distract yourself with screens, obviously. But a lot of time what's going on is their screens are encouraging them to like turn inward and to ruminate. So they're kind of scrolling negative content on social media, and that's making them feel worse about themselves. And then they're ruminating, and it's like, well, you got to put that down, and you got to go outside, and you got to do something else and take your mind off of it. And then it turns out that will snowball, right? Like, if you're out doing something productive, even something as simple as, let's keep it focused, just for simplicity, keep it focused on the self. Like, even if it's something like taking on a new exercise program or physical fitness activity, you're not really doing anything necessarily to help your community. It is still self-focused, but you're focusing your energy outward. Like, you're pushing yourself, in this case, like literally you're pushing yourself forward physically, whether you're running or lifting weights or practicing martial arts or playing a sport. And that is going to focus your attention on, you know, your cognitive energy on the activity you're doing. And not only does that like distract you, but over time, like that gives you something to feel proud of, like you start to feel good. And of course, there's all sorts of other potential biological, you know, physiological things that are specific to physical exertion that might benefit your mood. But in general, it's like it's pushing that energy outward and away from yourself instead of like turning it inward and letting it just really start to grow and bother you. And so I think that channeling of the energy is different than suppressing negative feelings. It's almost like pushing those feelings out of yourself and allowing you to really expand. And if you think about at least the way I think about motivational psychology, which is really what my background is in, is you can, you know, in a very simple way, you can think about human motivation in terms of defense and growth. And defense is when we feel threatened and we kind of lock down, we become rigid and dogmatic because we're trying, the point is to avoid further harm. So loneliness causes a defensive posture. For instance, if you're lonely, you're worried about further social rejection. So you avoid other people, which is why loneliness is so bad. Chronic loneliness is so bad because it makes you more lonely because you're avoiding people. So that's like turning inward and being defensive. What I'm arguing for is, you know, the other side of the motivational coin is growth motivation. It's when you push yourself outwards and when it's more self-expansive. And whether that's physical fitness, volunteering, taking on a hobby, learning a new language, you know, increasing your education or your career growth, just doing something that involves risk, getting yourself out there, trying new things, interacting with people, interacting with nature, that's going to push you away from that defensive mindset. It doesn't mean you're not going to have setbacks because by definition, all that stuff is risky. You might go out and try to meet people and you might end up getting rejected. It might not go well. But if you keep doing that sort of thing over time, you build the types of resilience and like goal setting mindset that pushes you outside of yourself and away from those more negative ruminative thoughts.
So correct me if I'm wrong when I first sort of summarize how I see our current sort of modern society, and I could be a little off here in understating the degree to which people in previous eras were very busy. But it seems to me there's a little bit of a bifurcation where there's a certain amount of people that I look at their Google calendars, and as I mentioned, I just came from spending time with one of the presidential candidates, and who's more regimented in terms of one place after another, you know, overscheduled. There seems to be a sort of group of people, and we hear this a lot in terms of teenagers, but there could be very overscheduled, and there's a lot of people who are kind of running from place to place and maybe even overdoing it. And there seems to be, you know, another group of people in the society who are doing sort of not very much and are spending a lot of time sort of on their computers, on their phones. And maybe it's always been like that, but it just seems to me that there's kind of these two groups of people. And I'm wondering, for the people who are already out there, already doing a lot, what does your psychology background say about people who are kind of overscheduled or maybe out there all the time doing some of the things you're talking about, or would advise someone who's anxious or depressed, and maybe they're, you know, I did an interview with someone who wrote a book on burnout, for instance. He was a professor, I'm publishing, I'm seeing students, I'm teaching. It seems as though the world of today, perhaps exacerbated by technology, is also a place where people can become overstimulated.
Yeah, no, that's an important point. I mean, and when you were saying all that, burnout was kind of the word that came to mind as well. Is you certainly have, and I don't know, like I couldn't give you like percentage breakdowns, like, oh, here's the percentage of Americans who are overdoing it versus underdoing it.
I guess it's also subjective, right?
Right. No, and that's a good point. That's one thing I was going to say, is that there are clearly personality trait differences or individual differences, and like some people really like stimulation. They're highly extroverted. They like being out there doing as much as possible. That to them, a fulfilling life is being that way as much as they can. It doesn't mean they can't experience burnout or other things. I mean, it really is context specific and depending on a number of factors. But in general, they're more likely to want to be out there doing that, whereas someone who's more introverted is going to, maybe what feels their set point for activity is lower. And so they still feel stimulated. It's just it takes less to to stimulate them. So there are those differences. But that aside, I think you are onto something that one of the challenges we have, and you see this in some other metrics, like when you see like we have like, people will talk about, well, the people that are like the most educated or the most successful seem to be the people that are getting married and starting families and doing things, while we have maybe this growing problem of people who just feel left behind. And along with them like dropping out of the labor force, like the prime age males dropping out of the labor force, comes other things. It's like they're not working, but it's not like they're doing something else. They're not out there stressing themselves in some other ways. From what I understand, a lot of the data suggests, if anything, they're at home playing video games or or on the computer.
Decided I'm going to give my life to others and be down at St. Francis Inn in Kensington every day. I might not be working per se, but I'm out there being productive in some sense.
Right. And that's, in my work a lot of my work is focused on the concept of meaning in life. And it's certainly what we find is the key to living a meaningful life, or having a strong sense that your life is meaningful, is feeling like you matter in some ways. And really that's a more of a social mattering. It's like I'm making a difference in the lives of others. And of course you can see that in a lot of people's work fulfillment. But as you noted, it doesn't have to be at a specific job. I mean, there's lots of people who are caregivers who take care of who raise children, for instance, and it's not paid employment, but it's clearly hard work, and it's clearly them focusing their attention outward and doing something that's arguably one of the most important duties in society, is raising the next generation. And so there's lots of ways people can contribute, but I think you're right that one of the things we're seeing is that there's an increased number of people that are just opting out entirely, that are not working, they're not starting families, they're not doing something creative or very productive with their time. And then you're right, on the other side, if anything, we have a hyper-productive class of people, perhaps, that is engaged in so many opportunities that they, some of them in fact run the risk of being overly stressed or burned out. But that's a different type of stress, different type of anxiety than the more like what I would call more existential anxiety, which is that that feeling that you don't really matter, that your life doesn't really have meaning.
Because it's interesting, because in terms of, because I think one of the essential philosophical questions on an individual level is, how should I spend my time? And I was in one of my articles this week called "Should You Read the Same Book Twice?" So the fundamental part of it is, how am I spending my time? And it's interesting because there are kind of different schools of thought on it. And I don't know if you follow on Twitter, he's very popular there. Naval Ravikant, he's on Twitter, and he says, better bored than busy. And it reminds me a little bit of Henry David Thoreau: a man is wealthy in proportion to the number of things he can afford to leave alone. And then I think on the flip side, it seems there are people, he doesn't do it anymore, but I remember at one time, Adam Grant, if you sent him an email about anything, he would answer. And I did that about various papers I was working on or whatever. And that's somebody who's kind of constantly in flux, at least at that time, as far as I know, working on things. And the best answer I can come up with is maybe, and I think you alluded to this a little bit, is that maybe different individuals are more suited for different types of lifestyles in sort of a personality way.
Yeah.
I think so. That's the conclusion I've come to. And I know for me, I'd rather be busy than bored, but maybe other people would rather be bored than busy.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good point. And I mean, that's, well, a couple additional thoughts. One, I think that's the advantage of living in a free society, or advocating for that, is because it gives more people the opportunity to really lean into their natural proclivities and skills, right, to develop their unique talents. And so I think that's good, because it's in a dynamic flourishing society, you're going to have different types of people with different types of abilities and needs and interests and goals and so forth. But second, I mean, one thing I would say that's interesting about boredom, and there's some pretty cool psychological research on boredom, is it's also very subjective in the sense that what you find boring, somebody else might find extremely stimulating or interesting, right? So it gets back to that individual difference point. But the danger of boredom is, to your brain, boredom is an unpleasant state that's functional. And what I mean by functional, it's fear is functional, right? Fear is telling you there's a reason to pay attention. There's a reason for you to worry about something, because it could be dangerous, and that orients you towards risk aversion or doing things in a protective way, being cautious, careful. But according to this research too, this boredom research, which kind of takes a similar sort of evolutionary angle, is boredom is an unpleasant state that's telling you you're not really doing something meaningful. And that's not necessarily bad, but what it triggers, what this research found, is it increases what's called the search for meaning. So when you're bored, then your brain's saying, okay, I'm not doing anything particularly meaningful. I should be. This feels unpleasant. And so it actually, boredom is good in the sense that it can foster a motivational tendency to reduce boredom, to go out and do something. Now, that doesn't mean the outcome is good. For example, there's research showing that if you look at rioting, like riots are sometimes driven just by boredom. You've got a bunch of young males, young people that they've got nothing going on. They don't feel like there's anything particularly useful or interesting they can do, and that can lead to destructive behavior.
In places like Philadelphia, it's so much crime committed by adolescents, men, boys.
Yeah. And so, but boredom can also obviously be channeled into very, very productive. And I think I actually wrote an article for you for Merion West on boredom, didn't I? Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, you did a couple articles with us a couple of years ago, which we really appreciated. And
yeah. So I think that's an interesting. I think boredom's one of those things that's interesting, because you could easily describe it as good or bad. But really I see it, again, I'm a motivational psychologist, so I see it from what's its functionality. And it does seem to be a signal to people that, I'm not doing anything. It's unpleasant. And they've done this work experimentally. So, and they've done these neat studies where they've had people do something really boring, like copy down the references for concrete mixtures on research, something that very, very few people would find that interesting. And just having somebody do something boring increases their search for meaning and their and so really it's what do you channel that into? And again, that's going to vary from person to person. For me, I find, I'm a more, not surprisingly, but I'm a more contemplative person, and I enjoy a relatively slow physical pace of life, going out and spending a lot of time in nature, spending a lot of time on my own thoughts, asking questions, reading, doing things like that.
Photos I see of your lifestyle, Clay, I think a lot of people would be very jealous of the degree to which you're kind of connecting with nature and other things like that.
Yeah, it's very, very, it's very important to me. But I'm not bored, and I'm certainly not inactive. Like, my mind is always spinning, and I'm always writing or working on something. And but some people would find what I do, especially spending out, I will spend hours just sitting in my office, working on a report or on a manuscript of some type. And to some people that would be very boring, but to me, it's very energizing. And so I think your point about different people, having different interests is key. But also, everyone needs to figure out what that is, because I think we do have a growing percentage of people that feel either useless or kind of at a personal level, or being seduced by this kind of nihilistic view in society that there's no point, this is a horrible country, or the future is doomed. And so it's not that they don't want it, it's not that they would maybe not want to do something productive with their time, but they've internalized this narrative that there is nothing, they have no agency, like nothing they do will matter.
I think it's interesting what you said a minute ago about how being exposed to boredom or tedium might inspire people to search out meaning all the more. And I'm thinking of famous writers of literature who had arguably boring day jobs, whether it's T.S. Eliot working at the bank or when Kurt Vonnegut had his Saab dealership. And I'm wondering if that was, in a way, actually helped fuel their writing because they're sitting there, dealing with whatever they're doing, typing invoices or whatever, and they think, geez, I need to get back to writing The Wasteland.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's not identical, but it's funny. When I was a professor, I mean, I'm sure some people have this view of being a professor as this like glamorous, not glamorous financially, but it's the life of the mind, right? Glamorous in the sense of, oh, you're just sitting around reading and thinking and preparing lectures and working on manuscripts, when a lot of the time increasingly you're doing like boring bureaucratic work, because the universities have, as the administrative class at the universities has grown dramatically, and so there's more and more just paperwork and things you have to do that are actually quite boring, or even just, you've probably heard professors complaining about the number of emails they get. And
every morning I was thinking about how unfortunate it is because a number of my family members were college professors who retired in recent years. And the refrain I would hear from all of them was the same to a T. I love students. I love teaching. I tolerate and even somewhat enjoy preparing for the lessons, but I can't stand the meetings and the box check. And it takes something that there's part of the job that is kind of the main part of the job that I love so much. But when we actually shake down the hours spent, I'm spending more time dealing with the other stuff than doing what I'm kind of there to do.
That's absolutely right. And so what you said a minute ago got me thinking about like my own creative inspirations. And certainly when I was a professor, I actually would set, this is going to sound cheesy, but I would set a day aside, Wednesday, and I called it Writing Wednesday. And I was like, I'm not scheduling any meetings with students or any other things. And I'm, generally just trying to block this off as the day for really focusing on writing. And it was the day I looked forward to. And it wasn't by chance I stuck it in the middle of the week that, I wanted to be like, well, if by the end of Tuesday, it's going to be 2 days of like dealing with boring work stuff. And then, I'll get a nice break in the middle of the week before doing more of that. And then of course the weekend. So yeah, I think that I'd never thought about it like that, but you might be making a good real case example of how boredom might actually inspire people.
So when you were talking about this idea of boredom or other sort of negative emotions as maybe one's brain's telling them that they need to change things up, I can't help but think, I know his name is sort of persona non grata in certain quarters. One magazine, which I won't name, had me strike out any references to his book based on his past plagiarism allegations. You probably know I'm talking about Johan Hari and his book Lost Connections, but interviewed him at Merion West. We're at the magazine, we believe in the idea of second chances. So I read his book and I found it very interesting, but I think that's one of the ideas he's trying to talk about a lot, that some of the negative emotions associated with depression, and he's trying to argue, is often your brain's way of telling you that you need to make lifestyle changes. And as you may recall, if you read that book or heard about it, he talks about a few different things that he thinks are contributing to elevated rates of anxiety and depression. Interestingly enough, and kind of up your alley, Clay, one, as he talks about, is sort of the disconnect from nature, and he cites academic studies talking about the differences in prisoners, whether their cells are facing inside versus out into the hills and such. But I think the two central takeaways from the book, different people might have different takeaways. Maybe somebody really zeroes in on the nature point or the relationships to others point or meaningful work point. But two is, the first of which is the one I just alluded to, about sort of these negative emotions being your brain or body's way of telling you things. And secondly, that, and this is another thing I'd welcome your feedback on, in many cases, improving what you do with your time and how you spend your life and exercise and getting up at a reasonable time in the morning and going to work or whatever you're doing in many cases is more effective than taking antidepressants for a certain section of would-be depression patients.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and we're starting to see that supported with, more compelling,
Yeah, it's sort of
large data set research. Yeah.
seems like a
Um,
bombshell study regarding the number of patients where a placebo is just as effective as an antidepressant.
Yeah, and and then there was a new study I linked to in my recent Wall Street Journal piece on that, physical exercise was more effective than, therapy or antidepressants. And so yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that I've been trying to do at the, we launched the Human Flourishing Lab at the Archbridge Institute last year. And one of the things that I've been trying to do, and I wrote an article, a long article in Perfectus, which is the magazine I co-edit on this, is like, I think we really need a new conceptualization of well-being, because I think you're absolutely right that we're underappreciating the value of negative psychological states and experiences. And so the current kind of, I guess, consumerist sort of Western and American like view of well-being, and of course I'm oversimplifying here, is like, I should feel good right now. And that's not like historically, like, how philosophers or theologians or, anyone has conceptualized the good life. And it's certainly also not consistent with empirical, more modern behavioral science research on what sustains long-term human flourishing. The obvious, like, simple examples, staying within the domain of physical exercise that, that we've been talking about, is working out's unpleasant. And it's really not until you get good at it, till you get some sense of mastery, that not only does it start to feel good, but you understand, like, that it becomes less uncertain because you understand that unpleasant state. Like, like if someone who's been lifting weights for a long time, for instance, like if you just started lifting weights, like, you're worried about injury, you're like, you don't want to lift too much, or maybe you accidentally lift too much, or your form's not great, or whatever. There's a bunch of stuff going on, but you don't really know when you've pushed you don't really know where that limit is that you should go a little bit further past. But as you get good at it, you understand the pain. You understand, like, you get the feeling like, okay, like, I need to push myself a little bit harder. I need to go just a little bit further past that. And when you get good at that, it's like you embrace the discomfort. It's the same for running. It's the same for anything else. And
I can't think
yeah.
of a better example even than running.
Yeah.
You're in the race, especially I used to run competitively, and you're in the race and you're in a lot of pain, and but you've kind of fight through it, and then maybe you win the race and you have your best time you've run, and you think, wow, what a payout for that.
Right.
We
Right.
even have a motto on the shirts of our track team that kind of said something to that effect.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that generalizes outside of physical fitness and athletics. So, as someone who writes a lot, people are like, oh, it must, you write a lot, Clay. It must be nice to really enjoy writing. And I said, well, I enjoy it, but not in the way I think that you're thinking of it. Like, when I'm writing, it's actually torturous.
Exactly.
Right. And it's, well, for one, I'm very self-critical. And so it's like never good enough. And it's never, I've got this book coming out in December, and the whole process of writing it was, and I almost quit a couple times, to be honest, just because of the number of things that were going on in life. But, it was not really, really a pleasant experience. And when I turned it in to the editor, I was just like, this thing's, this thing sucks. Right. I was pretty, but that's how I am about this. And then some time had gone by and I got it back with the edits. And when I was going through, like, the more like the clean kind of copy edited version, I was like, oh, this is actually pretty good. But to think, if somebody had the thought that, oh wow, like, you were enjoying this, it was like, no, it was very difficult. But that's why I think that, in this article, I talk about like the difference between like taking a longer term approach to well-being, which is, don't focus on the moment to moment, but what's the goal? What's the long-term goal? And goals that are really meaningful are often require uncertainty, pain, distress, all these things. And so again, going back to the mental health thing, if we told people that, well, you shouldn't feel that way, or you need self-care, or you need therapy, or like, if we told people to really like lean into like the discomfort as a way to avoid it, then in a lot of, not all instances, but in a lot of instances, we're pushing them away from what will actually lead to fulfilling life.
Is that one of the things Jordan Peterson's talking about when he's saying kind of stand straight and look at the abyss?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So it's interesting you mentioned in terms of the writing process, and I'm so glad you did. And not only because I write and run the magazine, but because I think it's such a great example. And I don't know if you read the book "The Gap" by Thomas Sudendorf, which is about some of the differences between humans and primate relatives. And I know now we have some more evidence that suggests certain other great apes can time travel a little bit in their minds. But he talks about how when he's writing the book, for instance, how sort of an unpleasant process it is and how he wants to do so many other things. But unlike some primate cousins, he's able to time travel in his mind and say, if I persevere and spend the next 2 hours writing, I'll be really satisfied for the rest of the week. And if I do this enough times, I'll be able to have my book and I'll publish it and I'll be really satisfied with my life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the human capacity for mental time travel is one of the cognitive advancements that I find the most fascinating. It's obviously, very central to my work on the psychology of nostalgia, which, not to take the conversation in this direction, but
I'm glad you did. I had that in my notes that I thought you can't talk to Clay Routledge and not mention nostalgia.
yeah, but what you just said is a perfect example, because it's that ability to project yourself into the future that is so critical for human progress, for civilizational progress, and personal like progress as well, right? And that also connects to our ability to look to reflect on the past. So oftentimes what we're doing is we're moving the self around in time, we're making these connections. A good example is, say you have a job interview tomorrow, and because of your ability to mentally time travel, you're going to be running simulations in your head of like, well, what if they ask this? What if, and you're prepping for it, and that's good, right? That's presumably that's better than just showing up with having not run any simulations. Now let's just say, for the sake of argument, the job interview goes poorly, and then you're like, okay, I got it, try again. Well, we can look back and we can be like, okay, what can I learn from that? Like, so even just from a basic learning point of view, mental time travel is great, because it can be like, well, that didn't go well, I don't want to repeat that. And then you run the simulation again for the future. So we're constantly doing that. And one of the things I found in my work is in addition to that very like more cognitive learning thing that our ability to time travel backwards helps us do, it also has a motivational dimension that's strongly related to nostalgia or sentimental longing for the past. It's like, when I'm trying to figure out what goals to pursue in the future, like what I should prioritize, like you only have so much time and energy that you can invest in different activities. I can think about, well, what's been meaningful in my past? Where have I had the most fulfillment? And for most of us, it typically involves close relationships. And then we're like, okay, I reflect on those memories or, personal triumphs, but again, typically very interpersonal in nature. And then you think, okay, well, when I'm planning the future, I've got to prioritize that. So I've got to remember the importance of that.
Great way of looking at it. Because
Yeah.
on the same token, as you're answering the question, I was thinking, in a way, a lot of anxiety, maybe less so some of the existential anxiety, you'd be the expert answer there. But it seems like a lot of anxiety is sort of negatively forecasting the future, and you're looking to the future and you're saying, what if this happens? What if that happens?
Yeah.
It can happen. So, and I guess that's kind of what Joshua Dienstag's getting at in his book on pessimism, that he's giving the example of Rousseau, talking about the only time he's happy in his life is when he's lying on the boat in the lake and he feels that he escapes from time, and that sort of the essential tragedy of human existence stems from an awareness of the passage of time. But as you're pointing out, there's also some very good things with time travel in our minds. We can obviously remember good past memories. And as I know you've talked about in the past with nostalgia, sometimes nostalgia can actually sort of motivate people to do positive things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, it's just I guess this very human trait of time travel in our minds has so many sort of ramifications with some of the things we're talking about.
Oh yeah, and the existential point that you're talking about too. I mean, it's people from, you mentioned Ernest Becker, denial of death, like existential scholars, and and social and personality psychologists as well, have long thought about this idea of our sophisticated intelligence, our advanced self-consciousness, which includes temporal consciousness, is a blessing and a curse.
Exactly
Because we can think about, like, we're smart enough to think about all these awesome things that we can create and build, and that obviously in a lot of ways enriches our lives, but we're also smart enough to think about all the dangers and all the ways life could go bad, including the ultimate one of our inevitable mortality. And so temporal consciousness can thinking about the future can cause a lot of anxiety. And what we found in our work on nostalgia is actually, that's why I started studying nostalgia. I was very focused on people's future-oriented anxieties. And then I started to look at, well, what are people doing when people think about the future, even topics that are unavoidable anxieties, like your mortality? How are they dealing with that? Because as it turns out, Becker talked about this, is most people aren't paralyzed in the corner, afraid to live. As a function of the awareness of their inevitable mortality, right? Most people are out there living their lives. There obviously are a few people that are paralyzed by anxiety, but most people are moving forward and doing things, living productive, constructive lives. And one of the things that, Becker emphasized, of course, the importance of cultural worldviews and hero projects and the things we invest in that allow us to feel transcendent. And this, and what we found is nostalgia is part of that. Is part of that resource kit. Like when we think to the future about the things that worry us, we not only do we get comfort from reflecting on our cherished memories, because that gives us some assurance that, yeah, like the future is uncertain, or my mortality is certain, but I've had a good life, I've had these memories, I've had these experiences, and that makes me feel like my life's had purpose and meaning. In addition to that, it orients you towards, with the time I have left, what should I do with my life? And so nostalgia really energizes meaning making. It really focuses your attention on how do I want to spend my time.
Well, I'm glad that you're talking about Ernest Becker. I know Harold Bloom used to say something like one's first literary crush is the most important. I think The Denial of Death is sort of the first book. It was recommended to me by Edward Hollowell, who was a longtime English teacher where I went to high school, and you just kind of recommend it in passing. I said, I guess I'll read that book. And I've been thinking about so many things, and was sort of also kind of my introduction into an early lens through which I viewed political philosophy, in terms of the sort of projects that people do to try to have a sense of meaning that might outlast sort of the transience of their own physical existence. So I'm wondering, before I get to sort of my last two questions, I'm wondering for those people who are kind of interested in existential psychology and Ernest Becker, are there any contemporaries of his who are writing around a similar time that they or myself should be more aware of?
I mean, this predates Becker, but if you want a more like aspirational or like positive kind of vision of like the human condition and existential psychology, and one that's greatly influenced my work in addition to Ernest Becker, is Viktor Frankl, of course. Man's Search for Meaning, which was how he developed his own approach to psychotherapy, focused on like the really humans' capacity for psychological freedom despite the conditions of our life. And his were horrific. They involved concentration camp, but despite the despite the circumstances that we can't control, we do control what's in our own. We can't control what's in our own thought processes. And so, his emphasis on the last of the human freedoms is is the freedom of choice, right? To choose how you're going to live, even in the most horrific circumstances. So I think his work is important. And as you know, I mean, there's a bunch of there are a bunch of other people as well. But as you know, like more recently, there's been a whole like theoretical and empirical apparatus based on Ernest Becker's work, coming from what's called terror management theory. And so terror management theory has its critics, and there's certainly like empirical debates about some of the hypotheses and some of the the research on what's the underlying driver of certain certain beliefs. But it's a very, very important. I think it's a very important theoretical position within modern behavioral science and social psychology in particular, because it's until terror management theory, there really weren't any empirical researchers in psychology studying in any like sophisticated way like how humans grapple with their most fundamental concerns about mortality, which of course is what Becker wrote about. We don't have to get into the weeds on this, but some of the criticisms about, I think, focus towards terror management theory is like people have other concerns besides death that motivate their different beliefs and goals and behaviors. And I think that's certainly true, but I think the best part of terror management theory, and I'm biased because full disclosure, like I co-edited the handbook of terror management theory. So when I was an academic, I've published dozens of papers in that area, and I've worked with different scholars on that. But I'm certainly open to the criticisms of the theory. I think I think they do a good job of taking Becker and put it in a more contemporary space.
How sensitive are you to those who argue something to the effect of, you might have a paralyzing fear of sharks, but you're not actually really afraid of sharks. You're afraid of death, but it's easier to kind of put your fear on this one thing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it seems like a lot of the fears that people have are rooted in the orientation towards survival. From an evolutionary point of view, the orientation towards survival in the service of genetic replication. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of fears are tied to mortality, but of course there are other things, and this is where I think it's fair. I mean, I think one of the criticisms of terror management theory is people have said, oh, they're trying to reduce all human motivation to like the desire to deny mortality. And I think some extreme voices maybe within the tradition have said that, but I see it more as like mortality is one of potential anxieties that people have, but a very big one, right? Like maybe the biggest. But clearly people fear social rejection. And people have other types of social fears that, I guess you could argue are rooted in mortality, because ostracism is essentially a form of social death that people, right? But even if you don't want to get like too deep into like the theoretical debates about what's the ultimate driver of certain behaviors, is it really anxiety about mortality? It obviously is a topic of great concern to human beings. I mean, if you just look across time, the various efforts across cultures and belief systems to come up with ways to navigate our awareness of mortality and to find ways to feel like we are transcendent and that we're contributing to something that outlasts us, that maybe even we're like living on in some afterlife. A lot of our efforts to leave a legacy, to find enduring meaning, clearly are influenced by our knowledge of mortality, whether or not it's the ultimate fear or not. I suppose is as important as understanding the practical value of realizing that it is clearly a motivational force in our lives.
So Clay, obviously I could talk to you till 8 tonight, but second to last question is, what have you sort of seen as the biggest difference having left North Dakota State and kind of leaving academia now? And sort of related to that, maybe all wrapped up in that is how's it gone, kind of running the magazine and sort of what's it been like since we last checked in?
It's been great, to be honest. I mean, when I left academia, because I had spent over 2 decades in it, of course, there was the concern that this is what I've done. This is what I've trained to do, to be a professor. And I had a pretty nice gig. I made it through all of the tenure hurdles or as a full professor.
Professor, right?
Yeah, I had a distinguished professorship. From that perspective, things are going well. But what's interesting is like I wasn't satisfied, and I was complaining. I mean, some of it was like the criticisms you hear about like the lack of viewpoint diversity and the like takeover of like the kind of wokeism stuff on campus, and that certainly was a real problem. But there were other, we talked about the bureaucracy components. I mean, all these things are interconnected, but what I found since leaving academia and moving to Archbridge, one, it's an institute that, very much on page with their mission. It's a very aspirational mission of lifting barriers to social mobility, and, championing the American dream and, people's ability to live more meaningful, flourishing lives. And, that positive vision is something that I very, very much share. But in terms of the day-to-day, I actually feel like more like what I thought being a professor was going to be like. I get to read interesting things. I get to meet all sorts of interesting people in different think tanks. And I still work with academics. We have a fellowship program that we recently launched at the Human Flourishing Lab, which allows us to help support academics who are doing relevant work in this space, but also non-academics too. In a lot of ways, what I'm able to do now as the director of the Human Flourishing Lab at Archbridge is have more freedom than supposedly people have with academic freedom in the academy to do interesting intellectual work, but also more outward-facing work that's really focused on helping regular individuals learn these ideas and figure out ways to improve their lives. And that's really what Perfectus is about too. Like it's intellectual in a way, but it's not inaccessible. It's not an academic journal. It's free for anyone to read. And it's supposed to, we're bringing different ideas from economics, from psychology, from education, from history, to people who are just interested in learning about things and what we think are some of the key ingredients to flourishing society and flourishing individual life. But also at the lab, we're developing videos and reports and working with different scholars. The goal is to create resources and tools that will be available to people who want to, don't want to just sit around and complain about how everything's going bad and sort of just feel like they're embracing this victimhood mindset, but want to improve their own lives and improve the lives of people around them. And that's really our goal at the Human Flourishing Lab. And we see that as a critical component of living in a free and flourishing society, is that individuals take responsibility for themselves and like see that they have a lot of capacity, a lot of ability. Some of the cognitive advancements we talked about and many others really allow us to be a creative, aspirational, goal-driven species that can do a lot to not just take care of ourselves, but like to help people around us and to build the society and for the future. And so that's very much what I feel like I get to spend most of my days doing now. And so that's a long way of saying it's been a great first year in the think tank space.
Yeah, I guess you're sort of seconding what I think a lot of people might intuitively sense that the think tank jobs might be some of the best jobs in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. It's still in that, the intellectual space that I enjoy, but also, it's very much about like there's a real world and we want to make a difference and we want to make a difference in the real world. Now, clearly there are academics doing that too. I'm not like They're very, very good academics working in doing important work at universities. I'm not taking away from that by any means, but I think increasingly with some of the concerns people have about academia, and especially as we start to see enrollments continue to decline in universities, which we will, for a number of reasons, but most notably the declining fertility. There's just fertility rates. There's just going to be fewer 18-year-olds in about 2 or 3 years in particular. I think 2025 is the so-called enrollment cliff, when college enrollment's expected to make another big drop. As we see universities like competing with other universities to attract more students, and the kind of customer is always right model, like we just need to get butts in seats. I think it's going to be even harder for academics to focus on doing the work they want to do. And in addition to that, like all the issues around really the kind of leftist takeover of higher ed that's demonstrably antagonistic to viewpoint diversity, and so that's going to make it harder to really do creative and interesting work.
So last question, and you basically already answered it, but just sort of to recap, because as we're talking about, a lot of the things you're doing are inherently practical. They're about helping people flourish. It's in the name. If we know somebody, or even see the tendency in ourselves to kind of dwell on everything's rigged against me, there's no point, everything's going to hell in a handbasket, what can we do concretely to snap out of the rut and be productive and get happy?
Well, I think when we're talking about ourselves, it's very good to have some concrete like objectives, like daily goals, because it's easy to get. I mean, the problem with bad habits is, they're called habits for a reason, right? We get stuck in routines, and so it's good to break that with very specific, I think, goals of like, here's what I'm going to do, and keep your and force yourself out of your comfort zone, force yourself to get out and do things. When we're talking to other people, I think the way human nature is people don't like being lectured. They don't like being told what to do. We have a strong desire for independence, particularly in our culture, but generally humans are that way. Like we have a strong need for autonomy, as the researchers from the self-determination theory literature would have done amazing work showing. We like autonomy. So it's not good to try to like coerce people into, what would make you happier if you do this. What's good is leading by example, and just trying to create positive opportunities for people. So if you know somebody that you think, they probably should really get out and get some exercise, it's probably not going to be real successful to lecture them, but what might be successful is to invite them, to say, hey, I was thinking about doing this, you want to come with me? And so positive, helping kind of push people, or orient people in positive directions. What's the saying? What's the famous saying? You catch more flies with honey. Kind of like,
I say that all the time, because they want to come out guns blazing, and I say no.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so it's good to recognize that. And I don't mean that in like a manipulative sense. I just mean it, and that's how human persuasion works, is people aren't idiots. Like you have to like treat them with a certain level of like dignity and respect if you want that in return. And you can help people, but it should be constructive and positive, not like, another way to think about it is going back to the defense growth motivation idea I was saying earlier, which is, if people feel threatened, they tend to like go into lockdown, right? So if you put someone on the defense, if you insult someone, if you put them in a sense that they feel I need to be defensive, then you haven't really opened the door very well to being persuasive. It's better to inspire and to encourage, and to kind of take the more thoughtful approach of like helping them see the positive and energizing them, getting them to want to it's, another way of saying defense versus growth is sometimes avoid versus approach. You want people to approach good things, yeah, right? So you want a student to say, I want to get a good grade. It's not as good to say, I want to avoid getting a bad grade. Like that avoidant motivation is not the best route. Like it's better to want people to aspire to see what they can gain to approach gains as opposed to avoiding losses. I think is a good strategy. And to be patient and kind and all the things that that people should know, but unfortunately are especially on the internet in short supply.
Clay, thank you so much for chatting with me. Always a pleasure. Hope we can catch up in a few months again, like last time. And I think one of the things you've left me to think about is going forward and thinking about what gave me a lot of meaning before when I'm trying to figure out how to use time. So that's really great. So Clay Routledge, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Eric. It was great to join you, and always happy to.
Yeah, take